Blackwave is on the air. Ready to hear a new scary story? Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Barcelona welcomed Ramiro with gray clouds, as if the city had a premonition that his arrival would bring something gloomy. On the Rambla, in the midst of a bustling stream of tourists and shopkeepers, he was met by his Aunt Alina's lawyer. The man, stern and businesslike, did not say a word as they ascended to the third floor of the old Gothic stone house. The door of the apartment, massive and decorated with wrought iron ornaments, looked like the entrance to some other world. Ramiro felt a strange trembling in his fingers when the key his lawyer handed him opened the lock with a quiet click. Inside, the apartment was luxurious but gloomy. High ceilings with moldings, dark wood furniture, heavy curtains that let in only dim light. The air smelled of old age mixed with a touch of incense. Everything here seemed frozen in time, as if Aunt Helena were not the mistress of the house, but its prisoner. The lawyer left Ramiro alone with his new property, reminding him of the condition of the will. The only thing you must remember, Senor Ramiro, is the rule that your aunt strictly willed you to observe. Do not go up to the attic. Ramiro nodded, though he was torn with curiosity. As he left, the lawyer added, "If you have any questions, contact me. But be careful with this house. There is more hidden than meets the eye." When the lawyer's footsteps died away on the stairs, Ramiro was alone. He walked slowly through the rooms, peering into the bedrooms, the library, and the spacious living room with the fireplace. All the rooms were neat, but covered with a light layer of dust, as if the mistress had left them in a hurry. He found the attic almost by accident, at the end of a long corridor behind a small door with a massive lock. The door was closed, but not locked, and Ramiro couldn't resist trying to open it. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase that led deep into the dark space above. His heart beat faster. Why was Annie so insistent on not coming in here? What could be so special about the old attic? With a force of will, he pushed the urge away and returned to the living room to concentrate on the papers the lawyer had left behind. Aunt Alina's will was odd but detailed. She had given Ramiro not only the apartment, but also a certain amount of money, as well as her collection of books and personal effects. The only condition was that the attic was not to be touched. However, the night brought uneasiness. Ramiro awoke to a strange sound like footsteps somewhere above his head. He sat up abruptly in bed, listening. The noise had stopped. Perhaps it was a play of his imagination, but the feeling that someone was watching him persisted. The next day, Ramiro tried to distract himself by cleaning the apartment and examining the things his aunt had left behind. In one of the rooms, he came across her diary, which revealed something of her life. She was a withdrawn woman, preferring the company of books to people, and in recent years had hardly socialized with anyone. However, there were hints of some attic-related fears in her entries. I heard them again last night. They're whispering to me, calling me upstairs. I must not give in to them. The attic is no place for the living. These lines awakened more questions in Ramiro's mind. What could such an entry mean? Who are they? During the night, the sounds repeated themselves. Ramiro could not sleep. It seemed to him that with every hour the silence in the house became more and more oppressive, while the attic, on the contrary, seemed to live its own life. On the third day his patience broke. He took a flashlight and opened the attic door. Footsteps on the narrow staircase echoed in the silence of the house. The attic space was shrouded in dust, cobwebs, and musty odor. But despite that, there was a strange energy here. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary storeroom of old things. Chests, boxes, antique furniture pieces. However, in the far corner, behind piles of trash, he noticed a strange object. It was a display case with a collection of masks inside. There were about a dozen of them. Some looked like theatrical masks, with bright colors and ornate designs. Others resembled ritual masks, with primitive but gruesome carvings. But one of them, carved from ebony, seemed to look directly at him. Its carved symbols, though incomprehensible, gave him a strange sense of unease. Ramiro took it gingerly in his hands. It was heavy and cold, as if the wood had absorbed all the surrounding darkness. As he turned to leave, he thought he saw a shadow flicker in the reflection of the window glass. Back in the living room, Ramiro placed the mask on the massive dining room table as he continued to stare at it. Its smooth, almost oily surface seemed to absorb the light, and the carved symbols curved intricately, as if deliberately avoiding his gaze. There were thin holes in the neck of the mask, like a place for a belt or rope. A strange feeling caught his attention. When the mask was near him, the air seemed heavier, as if the room were no longer so spacious. Trying to distract himself, Ramiro sat down at his laptop, determined to find information about his find. He typed in the search queries: black mask, ritual symbols, old wood carvings, mask collections in Barcelona. Most of the material found was about African or South American ritual objects, but nothing specific. A sense of tension was building. Something flickered in the corner of his vision. He turned but saw nothing. Only the dark silhouette of the mask on the table seemed even more ominous. It's just fatigue, Ramiro tried to convince himself, but deep down he knew it wasn't. In the night, it was as if the mask had come to life. A light scratching, like claws on wood, came from somewhere in the living room. He went downstairs with kitchen knife in hand, though he felt foolish himself, but the room was empty. Still, the mirror of the antique dresser reflected for a moment the figure standing beside the mask. It was too blurred to make out the details, but clear enough to make Ramiro recoil. Just tired, he repeated again, though Head set the knife aside next to the bed before falling asleep. The next day, his thirst for the truth about the mask overpowered his fear. He visited an antique store, hoping the junk dealer might have something to say. The shopkeeper, a thin man with shrewd eyes, took a long look at the picture Ramiro had shown him on his phone. "This mask is not from around here," he said at last. "The symbols remind me of something old, almost prehistoric. But you shouldn't play with it, kid. Some things are better left alone." Ramiro felt disappointed and annoyed. He had hoped for more. "Is that all you have to say?" The old man shrugged his shoulders. "I've seen something similar in the archives. Try the Central Library of Barcelona. They have a department of mystical artifacts there." The library, with its imposing stone vaults, impressed Ramiro. The department the junk dealer had mentioned was downstairs, almost in the basement. The dark, cramped shelves of thick folios and faded records smelled of dust and damp. After hours of searching, he came across an old illustration in a book devoted to ancient curses. It showed a mask remarkably similar to the one he had at home. Underneath, it was an inscription in Latin: Instrumentum Umbri. Instrumentum Umbri. The text described the ritual associated with the mask. It was created by priests who believed it served as a vessel for dark spirits. The mask not only granted its owner wealth and power, but also required sacrifice. According to legend, whoever wore it lost his soul, leaving his body to be inhabited by a dark entity. Ramiro closed the book with a shiver in his hands. When he returned home, he felt that the atmosphere of the apartment had changed. The walls seemed closer, the air seemed heavier. Ramiro walked cautiously into the living room and froze. The mask was no longer lying on the table. It was standing upright, right in the middle of the table, as if someone had just put it there. Someone came by. Is this a joke? He looked around the door, and windows all were closed. Ramiro wasn't superstitious, but his mind was beginning to wander. Soon the mask's voice became apparent. Deep, whispering, as if from far away, it echoed through the room. "You're looking for answers, Ramiro, but I can give you more. I can give you everything." Ramiro froze, unable to believe his ears. "Who is there?" he shouted, but there was no answer. It was only a moment later that the voice filled the silence again. "Put me on the victim. Embrace my power, and everything you dream of will be yours." The next days became a real test for Ramiro. The mask, like a living inhabitant of the house, was everywhere. Even when he left the apartment, he felt its presence like a splinter in his mind that could not be removed. At first, he tried to ignore the whispers that sounded at night. They were muffled, as if through a dense fabric. But the more he resisted, the more distinct they became. "Ramiro." The voice repeated his name over and over. "You know what you want? I can give it to you." He tried to distract himself by immersing himself in his work, but questions swarmed in his mind. Where had that mask come from? Why had Aunt Helena left it behind? Why had she warned against the attic? And, most importantly, what had she meant when she had written in her diary, "The attic is no place for the living"? One evening, Ramiro received a call from his old friend Antonio. They hadn't seen each other in years, but Antonio happened to be in Barcelona and suggested they meet. Antonio was a collector, a fan of all things rare and mysterious. The dinner conversation quickly turned to finds and artifacts, and Ramiro mentioned the mask, almost automatically. "I have something unusual. Would you like to see it?" he offered, not quite sure why Head brought it up. Antonio's eyes lit up. Had always been fascinated by mysticism and antiquities. "Of course." "At your place?" Antonio arrived that same evening. As soon as he saw the mask, his enthusiasm reached its limit. "It's incredible. Do you realize what you're holding? It's obviously a ritual object. These things are worth a fortune." Ramiro was silent, looking at his friend. Antonio had always been successful, charismatic, a man loved by everyone. Ramiro had envied him, but now he felt a strange mixture of anger and excitement. The whisper came again, closer, almost in his ear. "He wants it. Put me on him. You'll see how easy it is to do." "What did you say?" Antonio interjected, turning around. "Nothing," Ramiro answered quickly. "I just wondered if you wanted to try it on. It might be interesting." Antonio laughed. "Well, I'm certainly a fan, but it's a little creepy." "Are you sure?" "Just for fun," Ramiro insisted, trying to keep his voice light. Antonio took the mask carefully, as if it were a jewel. As he began to try it on, something in the air changed. As soon as the mask touched his face, Ramiro felt a sharp gust of cold wind, even though the windows were closed. Antonio cried out, but the sound was quickly cut short. His whole appearance seemed to darken for a moment, and then he disappeared as if he had vanished into thin air. The mask fell to the floor with a thud. Ramiro stood stunned, unable to move. A few seconds passed before he realized that Antonio had disappeared. Impossible. It's some kind of hallucination, but the cold enveloping the room was all too real. The next morning, Ramiro woke up in a strange euphoria. He received a call from the company where he had long wanted to work, informing him that his resume had been approved. He also received a notice from the bank about an unexpected transfer of a large sum of money to his account. The whispers came again. "See? This is just the beginning." He tried to resist the joy, trying to convince himself it was a coincidence. But a part of him, dark and greedy, understood. The mask spoke the truth. Later, he tried to convince himself that what had happened to Antonio was only an illusion. But when he got a call from Antonio's wife, concerned that he hadn't come home, his heart grew cold. "You haven't seen him since the meeting?" She asked. Amirolit. No. He left right after dinner. But as he hung up the phone, he felt a heaviness in his chest. The mask belonged to him now, and Ramiro realized that his life would never be the same again. Several days passed, but the feeling of uneasiness never left Ramiro. Antonio's disappearance had become a mystery that no one seemed to be able to explain. The police thought he might have left without warning, but Antonio's friends and family began to call Ramiro persistently. Every question they asked, "Are you sure nothing happened?" sounded like an accusation. The mask had been lying in the living room all this time, in the same place where Ramiro had left it after that night. In the silence of the apartment, he often caught himself staring at it for too long. Sometimes he thought she moved slightly, turning toward him as if she were alive. The whispers became part of his daily life. They never stopped, could be heard even in the daytime bustle of the city. It wasn't a mistake, the voice said. He had received his destiny. You received your reward. It's a balance. Ramiro tried not to listen. He searched for an explanation, clinging to the remnants of rationality. Maybe it was a dream, or shock after stress. But every time he tried to think of the mask as a mere object, something reminded him of its power. For example, on the third day after Antonio's disappearance, his boss had suddenly called him into his office and offered him a promotion. "We've been watching you for a long time, Ramiro. I think you can handle more responsibility," he said. Although Ramiro accepted the offer, everything inside him burned with terror. He couldn't ignore the connection between Antonio's disappearance and the sudden successes that were raining down on him like gold. That same evening, Ramiro went back to his aunt's diary in search of answers. She had written about how the mask had become part of her life when she was still in her early 20s. "I found it in one of the antique stores in the Gothic Quarter. At the time, it seemed like just a beautiful souvenir. But then the voices began. Whispers that never stopped. Ramiro turned several pages, rushing to the most important one. I thought I could control her. I thought her promises were just a temptation I could overcome. But I was wrong. My brother came first. Then my husband. Each time I thought it was the last time, but she always came back. She demanded more. The only salvation was to hide it where no one could find it." Ramiro's eyes slid to the attic in the silence of the night. Elena had tried to stop this evil, and now it had found him. The voice returned in the night, but now it sounded not like a whisper, but a deep baritone echoing in his mind. "You understand, Ramiro? One man, one sacrifice is nothing compared to what you can gain. Look how your life has changed. You want more. I know you do." Ramiro felt the surge of anger. "Shut up. He'll never do it again." The voice only laughed, cold and cruel. "You've already done it. You know you've tasted power. Without it, you're nothing." Ramiro fell to his knees, covering his face with his hands. He felt two desires struggling inside him. One to get rid of this dark power, the other to let it lead him on. The next morning, his neighbor on the landing, an elderly woman named Carmen, knocked on the door. She brought him a pie, thanking him for the help with the heavy bags he had given her earlier. "You are such a kind man, Ramiro," she said with a smile. Her words hurt him. He didn't feel like a kind man. He felt like a monster. For a moment, her gaze lingered on the mask. "What an interesting piece. Is it an antique?" "Yes," he answered dryly, trying not to give away his anxiety. "I'm sure it has a history. I'm sure it has a story to tell." Her voice gave him a strange idea. Carmen was lonely. She had no close relatives, and if something happened, no one would notice right away. Ramiro immediately pushed the thought away, shuddering. "What are you doing? This is crazy." But the mask's voice didn't hesitate to answer. She was chosen by fate. No one will miss her. Do this, and you'll get more than you can imagine. Ramiro struggled with the thought all day. but by evening his resistance had weakened. He invited Carmen to tea, feeling the darkness growing in his soul with each step. Carmen sat at the living room table, talking about her youth. She didn't notice Ramiro's gaze growing colder and colder. He carefully took the mask from the table and stood behind her back. "Is something wrong, Ramiro?" she asked, turning around. He felt his hands shaking, but the voice inside him commanded, "Put it on. She's ready for herself." Crying out, Ramiro put the mask on Carmen. She cried out, but soon her body began to shake, and a bright light seemed to burst from under the mask, illuminating the room. Then everything went quiet. Carmen was gone. The mask fell to the floor. The air was cold, but Ramiro felt a rush of strength, as if his chains had been removed. He sat down on the floor, breathing heavily. At that moment, he realized that there was no turning back. After Carmen's disappearance, Ramiro's apartment seemed to take on a life of its own. Whispers became a constant background. The masked man's voice no longer confined to short phrases. It spoke to Ramiro, tempted him, persuaded him. "Now you're beginning to understand how things work. It's not a curse, Ramiro. It's a gift. Your family kept him in the shadows, afraid. But you were different. You were made for more." Ramiro began to notice a change in himself. His sleep became short and heavy, but that didn't stop him from feeling energized. His thoughts grew bolder, and his fear was gone. He couldn't deny it. The mask was giving him things he hadn't even dreamed of before. Still, a part of Ramiro continued to fight himself. He opened Aunt Elena's diary again, feeling he had to find answers. This time he scrutinized the last entries made before her death. "I feel her presence every night. She calls to me, wanted her power back. But I won't let her. I've locked her away where she belongs. The attic is her prison, but it's also mine. Every time I go up there, I hear them. They're watching me. They're waiting for someone to break." Ramiro flipped through a few pages and found details about the mask's origin. "My grandmother brought it from Latin America. It was part of a ritual associated with sacrifices. My grandmother believed that the mask was created to bind a person's soul to the spirit of darkness. At first she thought it was an artifact, but she soon realized she was alive. Each sacrifice makes her stronger. She doesn't just give power. She takes it from others." Those lines struck Ramiro like a bolt of lightning. He began to realize that every sacrifice he made fed not only his success, but the mask itself. Grandmother tried to destroy it. She burned the chest where it lay. But the next day the chest was intact and the mask was inside. This curse cannot be destroyed, only passed on. Ramiro realized. His family had hidden the mask for decades, fearing its power, but no one could give it up completely. Trying to find more information, Ramiro went to the Central Archives of Barcelona, where old records about his family were kept. There he found references to a grandmother who had lived in the same house in the early 20th century. She was known as a strange and withdrawn woman who avoided her neighbors. One of the archival documents told of her husbands, 3 men, each of whom suddenly disappeared. At the time it had been written off as their own problems, but Ramiro understood the mask had taken them. What shocked him even more was that several of his grandmother's neighbors had also disappeared during those years. Newspaper clippings contained their names. One of them was Carmen Rodriguez, whose disappearance was still a mystery. Ramiro felt the ground slipping from under his feet. The mask not only demanded sacrifice, it created a chain of events that linked generations. On his way home, Ramiro went into an antique store, where he decided to try to find some clues about what to do next. The salesman saw his face and frowned. "You look like you're in serious trouble, friend. Are you sure you're all right?" Ramiro didn't reveal everything, but he gave a hint. If a man has something unusual and useful, but at a great cost, Do you think it's worth getting rid of? The salesman looked at him carefully. Sometimes it's not a question of whether you can get rid of it. Sometimes the question is who's next. These things, he paused, usually come back. Ramiro didn't argue. He thanked the salesman and left, feeling the noose around his neck tighten tighter and tighter. That same night, Ramiro heard the masked voice again. You have learned the truth. Now you understand why your family feared her. But, Ramiro, you're not like them. You see the potential. They hid it, and you're using it. Ramiro tried to resist. This is the end. I will destroy you. The voice broke into laughter, cold and long. You can't destroy what's yours. You know you can't do anything without me. The next morning, Ramiro found a list of names on his desk. His own handwriting, but he didn't remember writing them. They were his acquaintances, his neighbors, even his colleagues. The mask had made its choice. Ramiro sat at the kitchen table, staring at the list of names that lay before him. There were 10 of them, each one he knew personally. Neighbors, colleagues, friends. He didn't remember writing them, but his handwriting left no doubt. The whispering of the mask intensified, becoming an insistent muttering that filled the apartment. These people are insignificant, Ramiro. They don't even know what they're destined for. But you can be great. He grabbed the sheet of paper and tore it to shreds, but as soon as he turned away, the list was back on the table, whole, without a trace of damage. You can't just stop. You've gone too far, he thought. From that day on, an irreversible change began in Ramiro's life. People on the list began to suffer strange misfortunes. One of his co-workers, Javier, broke his arm in a ridiculous accident. The downstairs neighbor was hospitalized with an unknown illness. Ramiro noticed that these events only happened when he tried to resist the mask. When he let its whispers pass or didn't pay attention, chaos ensued around him. Do you see? Spoke the masked voice. The fate of these people is already sealed. Better make it quick and take what is yours. Ramiro tried to leave the house, but wherever he went, the whisper followed him. On the street, in cafes, even on the subway, he heard his own voice ordering him to obey. Ramiro returned to the library to study the ancient texts on curses. There he found a folio that spoke of entities imprisoned in objects. Such artifacts cannot be destroyed by normal means. The only way was to give them to someone who would accept the power willingly. It was clear to him. The mask would never let him go until he passed it on to another person. But that meant he had to choose who would be the next victim. Back at home, he encountered her voice again. You know how it works, Ramiro. Every one of those before you made a choice. You either feed me, or I take what's yours. What will you take? He whispered, feeling fear take over him. Everything. Success. Life. You're not the first person to try to leave me, and everyone who resisted ended up the same way. The mask laughed, but Ramiro heard something else behind her voice. Faint, agonized moans. They belonged to those who had once worn it. He realized that the souls of those people were not gone, they were still bound to the mask. Remembering the words from his aunt's diary, Ramiro came to a terrible decision. If he could not destroy the mask, he must choose someone to be its new wearer. A name appeared in his mind, Laura. She was his ex-girlfriend who had once betrayed him by leaving him for a more successful man. Ramiro justified himself by saying that Laura deserved it. She was a cheater, self-serving, and her life didn't matter to him. He met her at a cafe, ostensibly wanting to talk about the past. Laura was polite but wary. Are you all right, Ramiro? She asked, noticing his nervousness. Yes, I just wanted to return something that reminded me of you. He handed her a cloth-wrapped mask. It was a gift. I think ITLL fit you. Laura accepted it, laughing, but her laughter was quickly cut short when she touched the mask. Her face turned pale and her gaze froze. "What is this?" "Just an old souvenir," he lied. In that moment, he was relieved. The mask no longer belonged to him. The next day, Ramiro felt a strange emptiness. His successes had begun to crumble. His project at the company had failed. The bank had notified him of a mistake that had caused him to lose most of his savings. That evening, there was a knock on his apartment door. Laura stood on the doorstep. "You gave it to me on purpose," she said, her voice cold, almost inanimate. You knew what it was. Ramiro tried to close the door, but she was already inside. She had the mask in her hands. "Did you think you were rid of her, Ramiro? She doesn't let you walk away from her that easily. She wants you to be a part of her forever." Laura put the mask over herself. Her body trembled and black tears flowed from her eyes. Then she reached out and grabbed Ramiro's wrist. "You will never be free," the mask's voice whispered. The next morning, Ramiro woke up in his apartment, but something was wrong. His reflection in the mirror seemed alien. The mask lay on the table, but it was different now. The carvings were more intricate and the symbols deeper. He realized that now he was not just its bearer, but part of it. The mask whispered, "Welcome home, Ramiro. You are now one of us."